8-inch folding knife thrust into the human body 23 times. 23 times. Holding that knife in his left hand is the defendant. On the other end of the knife, the wrong end, is the mother of his 2 children. He stabs her in no particular order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 right behind her left ear, fracturing her skull, and the blade penetrates her brain. 23 on one side of her neck, all the way across to the other side, cutting her jugular vein, causing her neck and head to look like what can only be described later as a Pez dispenser. 23 times. Now in a moment, I'm going to tell you more about the young lady that was on the other end of that night. I'm going to get into more of the facts. I'm going to tell you how that stabbing came about. The young lady on the other end of the knife, her name's Jessica Goebel. And unfortunately, she's no longer with us. She passed away in the Sioux Falls Hospital on January 12th at the age of 26. Jessica grew up in Langford, South Dakota, just northeast of Aberdeen. She was a loving mother with 3 beautiful children. She was a loving daughter. And she was a best friend to her sister Shane. She always had a smile on her face, and she could brighten up anyone's day. She became romantic with the defendant 5 or 6 years ago, and they started a relationship. They ended up having 2 little girls, and they lived together in a house in Aberdeen. In December of 2014, that relationship became rocky. It's December 16, 2014. Jessica goes into a women's shelter in Aberdeen called Safe Harbor. She goes in there seeking services for a domestic violence situation involving the defendant. On this day, the defendant moves out of Jessica's house and moves in with his sister across town in an apartment. It's now December 31st, 2014, New Year's Eve. 1 week from right now, the defendant sticks that knife into Jessica's brain. He starts figuring out on December 31st that Jessica's probably seeing somebody else, and he's right, she is. She's got a new boyfriend named Richard Hanley, and that makes the defendant mad that he thinks she's with somebody else. He's texting her, he's asking her who you're with, he continuously asks her that. She tells him, I'm done with you, I don't want you to talk to me. And that makes him angry. It makes him so angry he can't stop shaking. And he tells Jessica this in text messages. He continues to text her over the next few days, asking who she's with and asking her to take him back. It's now January 5th, 2015. And in less than 24 hours, the defendant's going to slash Jessica's throat. He's still texting her, asking her who she's with. He's begging her to take him back. She says, no, I'm done with you. That makes him mad. But he texts her back and he says to her, consider your wish come true. I can't deal with this anymore, so I'll deal with it another way. 2 hours after that text message, he sends her a second one. It says, I'm going to come over to your house, And if you don't let me in, I'm going to kick that door in, and I'm going to kill that dude you're with. 24 hours before she's stabbed to death, he's sending her those text messages. It just so happens, on this date, January 5th, the defendant moves in one house down from Jessica with a co-worker named John Roach. It's now January 6, 2015. This is the day Jessica's dead. The defendant wakes up that morning at one house down from Jessica's, at a co-worker's. They get up, they put on their work clothes, they go into work, him and John Roach. The defendant's on the phone in the morning with Jessica, begging her to take him back. He's on the phone at his lunch break, begging her to take him back. He's on his phone in the afternoon break, begging her to take him back, and then he's talking to her when he gets off work around 5, begging her to take him back. Still in their work clothes. They go back to John Roach's, just one house down from Jessica's. The defendant sits down on John Roach's couch, and he's still on the phone with Jessica, begging her to take him back. And John Roach is sick of hearing that, so he walks down the block to meet up with a lady friend of his named Lisa at a gas station casino. Right around when Roach leaves, Jessica quits answering the defendant's calls. It's about 6 p.m. That makes the defendant mad, so he heads over to Jessica's just like he knew where he was going to 24 hours ago. He heads over there and he starts pounding on the door. Jessica and Rich are inside. Jessica's 2 little girls. Rich goes upstairs. He takes the 2 little girls with him to hide. Jessica opens the door, and the defendant comes barreling in, screaming, "Where is he? Where is he?" He runs right up the steps, and he goes into the bedroom, and he finds Rich. And the defendant starts swinging wildly. He catches Rich in his right eye, splitting his eye wide open, causing him to bleed. When the defendant gets winded, Rich gets his arm around his neck, and the defendant bites Rich's arm. Right around this time, Jessica called 911. She tells the 911 dispatcher, "John Hemminger is at my house fighting with someone." When he hears that, he takes off out the house back to Roach's. And before he takes off, Richard beats him out the front door, running from him. Richard leaves without his shoes on. He leaves without his white hooded sweatshirt, and he leaves his phone in his sweatshirt. When the defendant runs, he leaves his phone at Jessica's, too. The defendant goes back to Roach's house. He's sitting on the couch, and he's amped up because he just got done beating Richard up. Right around that time, Roach and Lisa show back up to the house, and they see the defendant sitting there. And the defendant tells them, "I just beat the shit out of Rich." He's asking if he can borrow a phone. Lisa ends up giving him her throwaway phone. The throwaway phone she has, it runs out of minutes at midnight. And during that conversation, the defendant tells Lisa, "I'm going to kill Rich, and I'm going to quote them both." He dials Jessica's number on this throwaway phone of Lisa's, and he talks to her. Talks to her throughout the night. Roach and Lisa leave around 8 p.m. and they head to a bar to throw darts and to leave it there. When they leave, the defendant's still on the phone with Jessica. He's begging her to let him come over, begging her to take him back, begging her to give her to Rich. Around 9 o'clock that night, she stops answering her phone, just like earlier in the night at 6. And just like earlier in the night at 6, that makes the defendant angry because he thinks Rich is back. This time, still wearing his work clothes. He digs through a drawer at Roach's house and he finds that 8-inch folding knife I told you about. He heads over to Jessica's. And right around 9:30 p.m., Jessica uses that throwaway phone that Lisa gave the defendant, the same phone the defendant has been talking to Jessica on. Jessica uses that to phone her sister and tell her I'm going to bed. 2 hours later, at 11:30, when the defendant's sticking the knife into Jessica. Jessica's neighbor in the duplex next door hears a female scream loud. The house right next to the duplex, the female that lives there heard a female scream loud. What I didn't tell you earlier, while the defendant's doing this, he cuts his left hand. And at some point, the blade breaks away from that knife handle, leaving the handle to be by itself. He punctures Jessica's spleen, her diaphragm, her lungs, her liver. There's blood everywhere. The two little girls are in the house during this. The 2.5-year-old that can walk and run around ends up with the defendant's blood on her shirt. And Jessica blood on her shirt. At this point, with Jessica laying on the kitchen floor, in a pool of her own blood, gasping for air, the defendant starts cleaning up. He finds Rich's white sweatshirt and he wipes up some blood in the kitchen. He wipes up some blood in the bathroom off the kitchen. He bleeds onto Rich's sweatshirt from his cut hand. He bleeds onto Rich's shoes that Rich left behind from his cut hand. He starts deleting text messages from his phone because he knows there's incriminating text messages between him and Jessica. He ends up taking those work clothes off that he had on when he murdered Jessica, and he stuffs them into a garbage bag. He runs them over to John Roach's house and ditches them. And on his way there, he throws away Richard's phone, Jessica's phone, and Lisa's throwaway phone. He goes back to the house and he wraps up his fingers individually, takes care of himself. With Jessica still laying on the kitchen floor with that gash in her throat, trying to breathe, he finally decides it's time to take care of himself and go to the hospital. So he calls his friend Jeremy Halstead at 1:53 a.m., and they head for the hospital. Right around 2 o'clock in the morning, the defendant calls 911, and he says, I just got stabbed by Richard Hemminger. What he didn't know is Richard is 3 hours away. The hospital getting care for his eye in Fort Yates, North Dakota. Richard can get free care on the reservation that he's from. But the defendant didn't know Richard was there. So he tells 911, I just got stabbed by Richard. Richard checked into that hospital 3 hours away from Aberdeen at 9:55. Just a few minutes after Jessica made that call from the throwaway phone the defendant brought to her house. About 10 minutes before that scream that Jessica's neighbors heard, when the defendant was sticking the knife in her, Richard checks out of the hospital. Him and his mother go straight to a hotel, Prairie Heights Casino in Fort Yates, and they check in. Right around midnight, they're on surveillance video going into the hotel room. They don't come back out until 5:30 the next morning. Everything we know that. Not when he told that story. So then he goes to the hospital to get medical care for himself. Jessica's still lying on that kitchen floor. Those kids are still in that house. When he gets to the hospital, the first officer that talks to him is Officer Brad Wolf. Officer Wolf asks him what happened, and he said Jessica was not at the house when I left. She wasn't there. It was just Rich. Second officer that talks to him is Sergeant Corey Pickerel. Same story. Jessica was not at the house, and the defendant was adamant she was not at the house when I left. Richard just stabbed me right before I came to the hospital. Richard's 3 hours away. He doesn't know that. Detective Sergeant Chris Gross ends up coming to the hospital with detectives. They start talking to the defendant, same story. He doesn't know Richard's 3 hours away, so he's telling the same story. I just got stabbed by Rich right before I came to the hospital. He's adamant Jessica was not there. Detective Gross asked the defendant, why did Jessica call 911 at 6 o'clock p.m. on January 6th and say that John Hemminger was at her house beating somebody up? His response, doesn't know. It's that point where Detective Gross decides to collect his clothes as evidence and go to the hospital. As they're bagging the clothes up, one by one, the very last item is a jacket that he wore to the hospital. They hold it up and they notice in the left-hand pocket there's something in there because it's a little bit heavy. Detectives look in there. They pull out the handle of that 8-inch knife. It's full of blood. They ask the defendant, how'd that get in there? He says it must have fell into my pocket. He's placed under arrest at that point. That knife handle is sent into the South Dakota State Forensic Laboratory, and it tests positive for Jessica's blood and the defendant's blood. Those clothes that he went and stashed at John Roach's house, the work clothes, sent off to the state lab, tested positive for Jessica's blood, the defendant's blood. Jessica ends up getting care flighted to Sioux Falls. I already told you she passes away on January 12th in a hospital bed. She was laid to rest in Langford, South Dakota on January 17th at Hillside Cemetery. This is the day Jessica's mom buried her little girl. Jessica's best friend Shannon, her sister, had to bury her little sister. Jessica's 3 beautiful children and to bury their mom. All because if he couldn't have her, nobody was. Folks, during closing argument, I'll come back up here and I'll ask that you find the defendant guilty beyond reasonable doubt of first degree murder. Thank you.
Conley, would the defense like to make an opening statement now, or reserve it for later?
Now, Your Honor.
You may proceed when ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. For those of you who I didn't get a chance to speak to during jury selection, my name is Tom Cogley. I'm an attorney from Aberdeen. Along with Mr. Gertis and Mr. McNeary, we represent John Hemminger in this case. And before I get too far into my opening statement, on behalf of all of us, on behalf of John, and on behalf of his family, I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you. We appreciate that each of you have agreed to give us your time and your attention in the days and the weeks ahead. We understand that it's not an easy thing to do. We're taking you away from your jobs, from your families, from things that are important to you. We know that, and we appreciate that. And I want to say that at the beginning of this journey, because that's what we're about to embark on. We are about to embark on a journey, an investigation for truth and for justice. And in order to do that, we are going to have to take up a good deal of your time. There's just no other way around it. And I can guarantee you, as we go through this evidence, and as we listen to the witnesses, it is going to take you longer to make your decision in this case than it took the Aberdeen Police Department to conclude that John Hemminger was guilty of murder. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a tendency as we go through this trial to let emotion rule the day. But you can't do that. The judge has instructed you that you are to decide this case based on the evidence. The Aberdeen Police Department believes that its duties have been completed. But your duties have just begun. And your duties will not end until you have delivered a verdict that reflects the evidence that is presented. A verdict that is free from sympathy for or against John Hemminger, or for or against any other party. Ladies and gentlemen, the oath that you took means something in his witnesses. Cicero said that he who violates his oath profanes the dignity of faith itself. And we expect, and we trust, and we appreciate that you folks will uphold your oath. This part of the trial is called opening statement, and it's just that. The closest thing that I can compare it to is any of us who have gone to the movies know that before the main feature gets played, there's coming attractions, and there's previews for those coming attractions. And those previews are intended to tell you what that coming attraction is going to be about. And that's a lot like what we're doing right here during opening statement. It is simply our attempt to tell you what we believe the evidence is and what we believe the evidence will show. It's important to keep in mind what the court told you. What we say here, what I say here, is not evidence. It is simply intended to aid you and to guide you and assist you as we move through this trial. And the same thing is true, and I need to be clear on this point, folks. The same thing is true about what the prosecution just talked to you about. That is not evidence. Those are not facts. Keep an open mind. Rest assured, this case is about John Hemminger. This case is about Jessica Goebel. But it is not about how Jessica Goebel died or the manner in which she died or the fact that she passed away. And make no mistake, folks, how she died and the fact that she died is a tragedy. But this case is about more than that. It's also about inexperienced detectives. It's about sloppy crime scene work. And it's about how police match facts to fit their case. And ladies and gentlemen, when the case is concluded and you've heard all of the evidence, the state is going to ask you to find John Hemminger guilty. And they have to meet that burden beyond a reasonable doubt. And the way that they're going to do that, frankly, is they're going to overload you with witnesses and exhibits. The last time that I reviewed the witness list, there were over 20 potential witnesses and over 175 potential exhibits. And ladies and gentlemen, as these witnesses come forward and as these exhibits are introduced, you are going to see that very, very few of those witnesses and very, very few of those exhibits are going to have any bearing on the decision that you have to make. One of the witnesses that was mentioned by Mr. White is Detective Chris Gross. Detective Gross is a sergeant and a detective with the Aberdeen Police Department. And he's the first detective to talk to John Hemminger in that hospital. The prosecution and Mr. White are going to try to tell you that he was just doing his job. And they're probably going to try to convince you that he did his job well. But what he did not tell you, folks, was before Detective Gross ever stepped foot into that hospital room to talk to John Hemminger, he was already suspicious. He read him his Miranda rights, and he treated him like a suspect. Now, he didn't want John Hemminger to know that. He wanted John Hemminger to believe that they were friends, and that he was simply trying to get to the bottom of the story. But what you will hear is that he had already spoken, Detective Gross had already spoken to Sergeant Pickle, and that he had been told that John's story, quote, wasn't making sense, and that John had claimed to have been stabbed by this Richard Handel individual. And what you will see is that Detective Gross, time after time in this case, anytime he met a fact that didn't fit his theory, he discarded it, or he explained it away, or he outright missed it. And ladies and gentlemen, one example of that involves John Roach. You are going to hear about the first time that Detective Gross and John Roach spoke. It was at the police department in Aberdeen. It was a conversational, it was a friendly conversation. It was much the same way that you or I would speak to our spouses or our children or our parents. And during that conversation, John Roach said some things that didn't fit Detective Gross's theory. It didn't match what he believed happened. So what does he do? He doesn't call John Roach and ask him to come in. He goes to his work site, pulls him off of the job in front of his employers, and he threatens him and he accuses him of lying. And ladies and gentlemen, what does John Roach do? He he does what any of us would do when confronted with that situation. He agrees with Detective Gross. Now that's just one example, and you will hear of others, of how Detective Gross investigated this case. Our criminal justice system, the Constitution requires that law enforcement investigate objectively and that they go where the facts lead. An investigation is an attempt to discover facts so that we can establish truth. And ladies and gentlemen, you will see that Detective Gross failed in his duty to do that. Another witness that will testify, and you heard about Richard Hanley from the prosecution. And Richard Hanley's going to come in, and yes, he's going to talk about an altercation that he had with John Hemminger. And you're going to hear John Hemminger talk about the fight that he had with Rich. And you're going to hear that John Hemminger said that Rich Hanley stabbed him. And then you're going to hear the evidence about the fact that Richard Hanley was apparently in North Dakota when the prosecution believes that Jessica Goebel was stabbed. And as you're listening to this evidence, you're going to be wondering, why does it matter where Richard Hanley is? How does the prosecution proving to us that Richard Hanley was in North Dakota and could not have committed this crime at the time they said it was committed, somehow prove that John Hemminger could and did? I want to talk more about the investigation, and I want to talk more about the crime scene and how it was handled. Because that's where the inexperienced part of this story comes in, folks, and that's where a lot of the sloppy is. Now, I would never accuse Detective Gross of being inexperienced. He's been at this for 115 years. He's the sergeant in charge of detectives in Aberdeen. He is not inexperienced. But you will hear that Detective Gross was concerned about the lack of experience of his detective squad. In fact, you're going to hear about a conversation early on in this investigation. And the subject of that conversation was why Detective Gross was doing as much as he was. And his response to that was because all of his detectives combined have less than 1 year's worth of experience. And that's important, folks. It's important when we talk about the physical evidence, when we talk about the crime scene, when we talk about what we would call the lack of integrity with a lot of this physical evidence. You see, because you will see that Detective Gross's fears were justified. The Aberdeen Police Department, in all of its infinite wisdom, assigned this crime scene to a young, inexperienced detective by the name of Mark Miller. Now, the Aberdeen Police Department had the opportunity to work with other agencies, and in fact, Detective Gross did speak to someone from the Department of Criminal Investigation. But despite the concerns that they had, the Aberdeen Police Department allowed Detective Miller, young, inexperienced Detective Miller, to handle this crime scene and process this crime scene. And when I talk about processing the crime scene, folks, what that really means is just gathering and collecting evidence so that it can be analyzed. I make it sound easy, but it's not. It's an incredibly difficult and technical thing. And it's very, very important to any investigation like this. Because this is not like buying a house. This is not like having a home inspection come in the midst of your home buying process. Because if that inspection finds something, you can fix it. Well, folks, you're going to find out that you can't fix a broken crime scene. You just can't. And as you listen to the evidence, and you hear about officers coming into this house and leaving this house, and state's attorneys coming into this house and leaving this house, and all kinds of medical personnel coming into this house and leaving this house. And you hear about how Detective Miller processed the scene, how he picked things up and put them in bags and took them back out. All of these things, folks, you will see lead to a contaminated crime scene. See, even when this stuff is done correctly, there can be problems. And if it's done incorrectly, there is almost assuredly problems. And you will see that the contaminated DNA is not helpful. You will see that any physical evidence that lacks facts, integrity, cannot tell you anything beyond a reason. It's simply. Ladies and gentlemen, as we go through this trial, please pay attention to the questions that we ask as well. Some of the questions might not make sense. You might wonder why we're asking them, and you might get confused. But the reason for that is you have to keep in mind that it's the prosecution who gets to dictate to you how these witnesses come forward. It's the prosecution who gets to dictate for you how the evidence gets presented. And I promise you that when the evidence portion of this trial ends, we will come back here and we will talk to you again, and the questions that we ask will make sense. The knife handle. The knife handle that Mr. White mentioned that contains the blood. You're going to hear about which officer handled that knife handle. You're going to hear about which officer handled John's clothes. You're going to hear about which officer handled John's phone. And you're going to hear about which officer handled Jessica's clothes. And you're going to come to the conclusion that that knife handle does not prove anything to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Keep in mind the commitment that you made, the oath that you made. During jury selection, each one of you promised that you would provide John Hemminger with a fair trial. You must cast aside any emotion and make your decision based on the evidence that gets presented here in the courtroom. And ladies and gentlemen, that might be difficult because, as I said, it's a tragic situation. But if the prosecution cannot do its job and prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that John Hemminger committed this crime, if you hesitate to state that with certainty, the only verdict that you can come back here with is not guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, when this trial ends, we are going to come back here. We are going to ask you to do something that no one in this case has done for John Hemminger so far. We are going to ask you to protect him. To protect him the way that the Constitution of these United States requires. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the great function and it's the great calling of the American jury. And that is what we are here for. That is what each one of you are here for. And when the prosecution fails to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt, you must be strong, you must be bold, and you must have the courage to stand up and tell them that they did not do their job, but you are doing yours, and you must render a verdict of not guilty. And we trust each and every one of you to do that. Thank you.